So the talk for today is about what constitutes parental engagement and implications for policy and evaluation. And I'm on the agenda for about 75 minutes, but I promise I won't speak all 75 minutes. I'm actually going to ask you at your tables to do some thinking and reflecting on some of the dilemmas that I'm going to present. And hopefully at the end there'll be time for question and conversation. So, there we go. The agenda for now is I'm going to do introductions and a couple of organizing questions. One of the things that I really agreed with that Karen Mack said was that a bullet-pointed list is not going to be as useful for you, given your particular context, as a set of questions might be. So taking that seriously, I've got a set of organizing questions that we'll think about in terms of parental engagement. Then I'm going to do a little bit of analysis for you about how the vast research literature on parental engagement is organized, why it's organized in the way that it's organized, and what difference does it make that that's how it's organized. And then I'm going to move from analysis to looking at an example of action, and there's a typo. I'm going to actually have us think about how one jurisdiction, Ontario, has sought to engage parents. And I'm going to look at one particular policy in light of the questions from the other, from earlier in the agenda. So, a little bit about who I am. So, I was a grade 6 teacher at an inner city public school in Texas that was 99% below the free and reduced lunch poverty line. I was a school teacher and administrator at a private school in Mexico, and now I'm an academic. And one thing that I've learned in my professional experience is if you're working in a school and you have an educational problem, blaming parents is pretty quick get out of jail card. In inner city schools, a very common conversation was parents aren't involved enough, why can't we get them to come, why don't they care enough about schools? In the privileged private school where I was a school administrator, it was a different conversation, which is why don't they know their place, why are they always in here, how come they have so much time, don't they understand I'm the one with the professional knowledge here, not them, it doesn't matter that they're an executive, etc. So for me, when I went to graduate school, it was an interesting question for me to think about why the starting point for so many conversations among educators is what parents aren't doing as opposed to what educators are doing to engage or to make fruitful connections between home and school. Because if it's going to be collective effort, if we've got these two institutions responsible for rearing children, it seems like if those institutions got along, that would be better for kids than if they don't get along. So that starting point, that the boundary between home and school is a contested one, and that the two institutions invested in rearing children don't always work happily together, leads to a whole bunch of different research questions. And every single research question that we're going to look at, like every policy intervention, has built within it an implicit definition of the problem. So in a meeting like this today, what problem are we trying to solve or address? I think that's one of the questions we're going to think about. Before I go on, just a little bit about me. So as a former teacher and headmaster, I have a PhD in educational policy research where I studied school principals in inner city schools. Now I'm a professor in educational leadership and policy. We used to call ourselves admin, but now we call ourselves ed leadership. I teach graduate and teacher education courses. I do research on school leadership in challenging circumstances and schooling and inequality. And I'm fluent in Spanish, and for the past several years, I've been, oh, you can't see that either. It looked fine on my screen. There's a multi-year project on school improvement in high poverty schools in Chile. So Chile is an interesting particular policy dynamic. It is a wealthy nation with very well-established, recently democratic institutions and a lot of energy around school reform. Yet there's profound inequality in their system, and so studying how school improvement happens in a rigidly segregated system is one of the things that I've been doing there. So, just a little bit about where I come from. I'm an immigrant to Canada, like most Canadians, and I live in Toronto. Toronto is Canada's largest city and its most populous province, which is Ontario. It's about 5.5 million people in the metropolitan region. About half of the population of the city was born outside Canada. And about a third of residents in Toronto speak a language other than English at home. I say English because although there are 2 national languages, Toronto is an English-speaking city. That's just by way of introduction of where I come from. It's the middle of the Toronto International Film Festival right now, so if you're a person who follows movie stars, those pictures are coming from about a couple of doors down from where I work. All right, so how is the research on parental engagement or involvement organized? It's a vast body of work. I mean, I thought about quoting to you the number of Google hits that you would get if you put in parental engagement, and I thought that was a little silly because it's so enormous. But it's organized around a set of unresolved tensions, and those tensions include, so what's the correct vocabulary to use? I heard this at my table this morning. Is it involvement or engagement? I heard that in the front here this morning. Should we be talking about partnerships? Are we talking about parents? Are we talking about caregivers? Are we talking about families? What about community connections? There's a set of conversations in this literature about what's the right vocabulary to use. Next, there's a set of debates about methodology, so research methodology. There is a driving interest in a room like this and also among academics to find out what works, okay? And so to understand what works, what should we do? Should we look at large survey data sets that compare student outcomes with self-reports from parents about the ways that they feel or don't feel connected to the school? Or is it better to do a fine-grained case study where we're inside of a school and actually observe how teachers and administrators and community workers are all working with parent groups to create a sense of common purpose? Or are we going to learn more from program evaluations? So a provincial government or a nonprofit organization funds a particular kind of program, so we evaluate it. Is that going to teach us things about what works? And then there's another set of unresolved tensions, which are who are the audiences for this published research? Researchers write for other researchers. That's how they get promoted and get tenure. But are there also, is it potential that are we talking to educators? Are we talking to policymakers? Are we talking to families? I think of this debate about the potential audience as the difference between the normative literature and the empirical literature, which is a fancy way of saying it's the literature about what you should do, that's the normative literature, versus the literature about what is being done or has been done, which is the sort of empirical literature. Now the next thing is, so we want to know what works, but what's engagement for? So that's where we're going to go in a second. All right. Now, thinking about the correct vocabulary. Robinson and Harris, I put them first, not because I'm the most fond of them, but just because they're the most recent. They've got a new book out published by Harvard University Press called The Broken Compass, and it's an extensive quantitative analysis of parental involvement, as they call it. And this is their definition for parental involvement. They say, we define parental involvement as practices that entail parent communication with their children about education. Beliefs or behaviors parents hold or engage in with the exclusive aim of increasing academic outcomes, and parental engagement with schools and teachers. Okay, so their definition of parental engagement is clearly its input parental involvement, output higher academic achievement. Now, I want to say a little bit as a sort of side note, as I was putting together the slides over the past week or so, I realized that what I'm trying to give you a sense of as an academic is what this vast body of research looks like to me. And one of the things is that there's a kind of mainstream set of beliefs, which is there's more is better. Parental involvement, parental engagement, whatever you call it, depending on your vocabulary, more would be better. But I think it's important to know that there are folks who make a charge at that kind of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is not the right word, but that set of taken for granted beliefs. One example is a book from 2001 called Rethinking Family-School Relations, a critique of parental involvement in schooling. This is a criticism that comes from a Brazilian researcher, and it comes from the left. She basically says all of these government attempts to encourage parental involvement and engagement is actually an example of a kind of neoliberal approach of governments washing their hands of what they should actually be doing. So it's a way of displacing onto volunteers what the state should be doing, which is educating children. That's her criticism. She's not been widely embraced, but it is a voice that we should think about as a criticism of the kind of taking for granted norms of parental involvement. The next one is this person named Whitman, who wrote a book for a nonprofit called the Thomas Fordham Institute. One thing about the United States, which is different from Canada, the United States has an enormous amount of private money influencing via foundations what happens in educational policy. Taxes in Canada are just too high, and it's a smaller country. So there's just not that much money that's involved in sort of influencing public policy, at least as explicitly and as directly. But the nonprofit sector in the United States is so big, with so much money and influence, that you really see big changes happening. For example, the guy who owns Facebook donated $200 million to the Newark public school system with the caveat that they had to implement a merit pay system for teachers. Or you see the Bill Gates Foundation investing billions of dollars in large city schools to take on the idea that large high schools are the problem, small high schools will solve that problem. So you take a place like Chicago that had 100 high schools, you break them into 3, so now instead of 100 bad high schools, you've got 300. And then, the reason I bring this up is that this particular work here by Whitman is an example of an educational foundation taking a stand on the question of inner city schooling that sort of works against the common orthodoxy of parental engagement. Although, whereas most people, you've heard it in Karen Mapp, you'll hear it from myself as well, would say that part of the problem of public schooling is that it hasn't made an effective connection with low-income or marginalized communities. Whitman says, don't bother. And he says that basically a no-excuses approach to schooling is what is needed, and that schools need to, quote, compensate for their students' cultural deficit, and the place that they get their cultural deficit is their families. So this, I point out, is just, this part of the conversation, right? So, and the third one is actually who I quoted first, which is the Robinson and Harris book, The Broken Compass. They have done a large statistical analysis of parental involvement, and they basically come up and say, we don't know enough about whether it makes any difference to spend all of this time and energy on it. And so they, and that's where their definition of parental involvement is important. So I just sort of give this side note so that we can be realistic about what the conversation is about parental involvement. Okay. Now, moving on to the more examination of what the correct vocabulary would be. So Debbie Pusher, who's a colleague of mine who lives in Canada, in Saskatchewan, she's well known, she's probably the best known parental engagement researcher in Canada. She says, while the terms parent involvement and parent engagement are often used interchangeably, to me they represent distinct conceptualizations of the place and voice of parents in schools. They're based on different assumptions and beliefs. And with parent engagement, possibilities are created for the structure of schooling to be flattened, for power and authority to be shared by educators and parents, and the agenda being served to be mutually determined and mutually beneficial. So that's one of the reasons, the move away from involvement to engagement. Now another researcher, Susan Auerbach, talks instead of engagement or involvement, she talks about partnerships. And she talks about not just partnerships, but authentic partnerships, which she defines as respectful alliances among educators, families, and community groups that value relationship building, dialogue, and power sharing as part of socially just democratic schools. So why am I bringing up this information about the different kind of vocabulary? I think it's important for a group like this that wants to have influence in the public conversation about the role of parental engagement to know that not everybody is using the same terms in the same ways. Right? And to be cognizant of which words you're choosing and what you want to communicate when you're choosing those words. Okay, so the next debate in the literature is about research methodologies and what will tell us what works. Part of the tension here is the tension between quantitative and qualitative research. So numbers and stories would be a way to caricature that. So which evidence is the most persuasive to educators or policymakers or researchers? I brought this up. Is it the analysis of large survey data sets or meta-analyses? Would it be fine-grained case studies or program evaluations? Robinson and Harris, and I don't really disagree. You'll remember they're the ones who say that it's maybe not worth the effort. They say scholars still disagree about how parents should be involved and in which aspects of parental involvement are associated with improvements in children's academic outcomes. So I bring up this debate about the methodologies because there's always this risk when trying to talk to policymakers that if you talk about complexity, they're going to say, well, we don't really know anything, so we might as well try this. And that's not the case. We do know a lot. The knowledge in this room will tell you that certain kinds of approaches are better than others. But you need to be aware of the sort of cachet that some studies have more than others when you're having these conversations about what matters. And what is really interesting is if you start to look, especially at some state governments in the States or even the provincial government in Ontario, they will tell you research shows blah, blah, blah. But there's never a citation attached to that sentence, and that always makes me a little skeptical. So I think that it behooves us to be careful about the claims we're making about what attempts to work on parental engagement or involvement give us. And I think that part of that conversation is also, it's not just a methodological one, it's one about purposes. Now, does parental engagement, do efforts to engage parents lose their value if they're not visible on a test score? That's the question to ask. I would say they don't lose their value if they're not visible in a test score, but you're going to have a hard time persuading a policymaker trying to raise test scores that investing in parental engagement is the right way to go with scarce resources if it's not going to get there. Okay. Now, another aside. One of the things that's interesting to me is, and this is coming from my experience in Chile. Chile is a system with most students go to what are called publicly funded private schools. So it is a market-based school system that was established during the dictatorship from the Chicago School of Economics. It's a voucher system. And just being immersed in the Chilean education system, I'm really interested that often the parental engagement or involvement literatures have nothing to say about the school choice literature. And I wonder why that is, because school choice is the most explicit expression of parental involvement in education that I can think of. So I just give that to you as an aside because it sort of occurred to me as I was working on this presentation that was interesting to me. All right. Okay. So, who are the intended audiences for the research? So normative versus empirical literature, are we looking for educators or parents? Are we thinking about teachers or principals? And I think the answer to this is, well, yes, all of them. The literature is actually geared, different studies are geared to different folks. And you even find it in large multinational sort of non-governmental agencies who are also making recommendations about the importance of parental involvement. For example, the OECD published a study in 2008 called 10 Steps to Equity in Education, and one of their 10 steps was strengthen the links between school and home to help disadvantaged parents help their children to learn. Okay, so one of the 10 steps in their list is making these connections. So they're clearly here speaking to both folks at the local level who will try to do this, as well as to policymakers, because that's this sort of super macro level between country comparative study. Now what I want you to do is a quick activity so that you don't have to just listen to me talk for 75 minutes. What I want you to do is to write a sentence or two, not an essay. that communicates your views on the purpose of parental engagement. What's it for? So write down your thought, share it with the person next to you. You're going to have a conversation at your tables for about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to take a couple of examples and then move on. So ready, steady, go.